Good morning to all of you out there in podcast world. It's 8 o'clock this Tuesday morning, April 9th, 2019. I am here now ready to share with you lesson number 12 in my audiobook of my book called Hebrews From Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. Lesson 12 covers chapter 5 of Hebrews, verses 4 through 10. If you have the book, that begins on page 85. So let's go right on into it. In chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, Paul concluded the prior paragraph, which would be chapter 4, verse 14 through chapter 5, verse 3, with reasons why Jesus qualifies as high priest by comparing him with Aaron, the first high priest. Number 1, both were selected by God from among men. Number 2, both were anointed to represent man before God. Number 3, both experienced temptation. Number 4, both offered sacrifices. And number 5, both were to exhibit compassion. Now, in chapter 5, verses 4 through 10, Paul demonstrated that Jesus is a superior high priest by contrasting him with Aaron. Again, he compared him with Aaron in the previous paragraph. Now he's contrasting him with Aaron. Number 1, only Jesus is called God's Son. Number 2, only Jesus was given an everlasting priesthood. Number 3, only Jesus was made a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And number 4, only Jesus cried out to God as the Lamb as well as the high priest. So let's begin with chapter 5, verse 4. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. This verse repeats verse 1. Every high priest is appointed by God. Paul reminded his readers of this in order to continue this topic with contrasts between Aaron, the head of the Old Covenant priesthood, and Jesus, the head of the New Covenant priesthood. What's interesting in this verse is that although the high priest was for man, chapter 5, verse 1, man wasn't allowed to choose his own high priest. Only God had that authority. So when anyone tried to usurp the position of high priest, there were severe penalties. 1 Samuel 13 relates how King Saul lost the kingdom due in part to presuming the work of a priest. Here's a side note. There are many who believe that Paul spoke sarcastically of the high priest Ananias in Acts 23 verse 5 because he was not authorized to be a high priest. And according to history, he was one of, if not the, worst high priest to ever occupy the office. Other examples of the foregoing are as follows. 1 Kings 12 relates Jeroboam's institution of an unlawful priesthood, and the kingdom of Israel came to ruin. 2 Chronicles 26 relates Uzziah's interference with the priestly office, and he became a leper. And Numbers 16 relates Korah's insurgents, also known as a rebellion per Jude verse 11, only to have the earth swallow him and his followers. Interestingly, Paul also alluded to this Old Testament story in connection to the Hymenian heresy, which taught that, by AD 65, the resurrection had already occurred, 2 Timothy 2, 17 through 19. In this passage, Paul is proving to Timothy that this teaching would be clearly verified as erroneous once Jesus came, in just a few years, at the actual time of the resurrection, AD 70, to condemn those who attempted to usurp Paul's authority as an inspired man of God. I have an entire study just on 2 Timothy 2, 17 through 19 on my website, asightforthelord.com, on the page entitled End Time Passages. Hebrews 5, verse 5. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, You are my son, today I have begotten you. The word glorify will be better understood as exalt. In other words, Jesus didn't exalt himself to the role of high priest, but the one who claimed Jesus as his son exalted him to that position. In this verse, Paul again, as in chapter 1, verse 5, quoted from Psalm 2, verse 7. Question becomes, why go through the trouble of saying, It was he who said to him, You're my son, today I have begotten you, instead of just saying, It was God who appointed him? Well, there's a good reason for this. Recall from the study of chapter 1, verse 5, that the idea in Psalm 2, verse 7 of Jesus being begotten and called God's Son has reference not to his birth via Mary, but to his resurrection from spiritual death, his birth or rebirth from death. you might say. Thus, Paul is implying that Jesus' resurrection and ascension to God's right hand, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, is directly connected to his being worthy of the once-for-all high priesthood. Why? Because he lives evermore to intercede for the saints, and because he, being the Lamb as well as the high priest, endured the lowest depths of human suffering and death in order to be perfected, just as chapter 5, 7 through 8 continues to discuss. Now, verse 6 goes on to say, as he also says in another place, that being Psalm 110 verse 4, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, although Paul brought up the priesthood of Christ being like that of Melchizedek, he strayed from this subject in verse 12, getting back to it in chapter 7. However, the point here for now is plain. That is, that unlike the Aaronic priesthood, the priesthood of Jesus is forever, just as that of Melchizedek, who had no beginning or ending as far as any record is concerned, chapter 7, verse 3. The word forever here in verse 6 refers to the idea of throughout the age. In Exodus 40, verse 15, God told Moses that the Levitical priesthood would be an everlasting priesthood, defined by God in the next phrase, though, as saying, throughout their generations. That is, throughout their generations was forever for them, see? And we know that their generations ended at the demise of Jerusalem, in large part due to the fact that all the genealogical records were destroyed. So, since Jesus will never cease to exist, his high priesthood will never cease to exist. Unlike high priests such as the Acts 23 Ananias, who most are convinced usurped the office, Jesus, even though he wasn't of the lineage of Aaron, did not usurp the office of high priest because it was appointed by God that he would be high priest hundreds of years before he was even born. In addition, his priesthood would be like that of Melchizedek, who lived long before the Aaronic or Levitical priesthood came into existence. Another interesting thought this verse brings up, discussed later at length in chapter 7, is that Melchizedek, unlike Aaron, wasn't a mere priest. Rather, he, like Joshua of Zechariah chapter 6, was also a king. Check out Hebrews 7 verse 2 with that. Jesus, or Yeshua, therefore, as the clear antitype of Melchizedek and the Zechariah 6 Joshua, is priest and king. Zechariah 6:13 says that the Messiah, he shall rule from and be a priest on his throne. Remember what happened to King Uzziah when he attempted to fill the roles of both king and priest? He was judged by God and cursed with leprosy, for that privilege was reserved for God's Messiah only. Okay, moving on to verse 7. Who, that is Jesus, not Melchizedek, see verse 8 about that, in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement, that is passionate, cries and tears, to him, that is the Father, who was able to save him from death, was heard because of his godly fear. To most commentators and scholars, it seems obvious that this statement is an allusion to Jesus' prayers to the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was betrayed by Judas. And it also seems obvious that Paul brought this up to emphasize his argument that, although Jesus didn't commit sins as other high priests, he did suffer as they did. It would be appropriate at this point to read Matthew chapter 26, 36 through 44, while recalling Luke's record of help from an angel during this taxing time. The word offered was used of the priest who brought a sacrifice to the altar of God. Hence, prayer is a sort of sacrifice, a sacrifice of the lips. Check out Hebrews 13 verse 15 with that, which is why a saint's prayer was called an offering in Revelation chapter 8 verses 3 and 4. When used separately, the words prayers and supplications are used interchangeably, but when used together, they refer to a prayer prompted by a deep sense of helplessness. Instead of the clause about the Father being able to save him from death, meaning that God could save Jesus from dying, it actually means that God could, and did, bring him out of the state of the 3-day death of their relationship which he had to suffer for sin. Check out Matthew 27:46 and Galatians 1:1. After all, certainly it wasn't physical death God's Son dreaded, but being separated or cut off from his Father. The word fear in verse 7 isn't the word which means to be afraid. Rather, it highlights the idea of respect, which is why the adjective godly is suitably supplied in the New King James Version. Jesus' prayer was heard because of his respect for his Father, a respect that wasn't only demonstrated in his prayer, but also throughout his life. And what was the result? Jesus was raised from the dead, taking us right back to the thought of Psalm 2 verse 7 as we read in chapter 5 verse 5 moments ago. Alright, moving on to verse 8. Though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things he suffered. The word son here isn't a reference to Jesus as a son of man, but as a son of God, the indefinite article indicating his relational position to the Father. The word learned refers to an understanding that comes by experience, not merely by instinct or instruction. This is evident because it specifically states that he learned from the sufferings he experienced. In fact, in Greek there's a figure of speech called paranomasia, which is used here to indicate that he suffered, he learned. You can find that in E.W. Bullinger's Figures of Speech book on page 307. The idea is that even though Jesus as God knew what obedience was in the sense of what we call head knowledge, he didn't know what it was from experience. In other words, Jesus as deity minus humanity was never tempted to disobey the Father, which is why and how he learned obedience. Or we could say, which is why and how he learned about obedience. A good lesson this verse clearly teaches is that suffering is not always the consequence of one's personal sins. Rather, adversity is meant to edify. Here are questions to pose ourselves. If God's Son had to learn obedience, shouldn't his followers learn it as well? And if God's Son had to obey, should we expect special favors such as the right to disobey? Anyway, moving on to verse 9. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Basic idea behind the word perfected in verse 9 refers to a person's or even a people's attainment of God's goal. So this initial phrase points to how Jesus reached God's goal for him concerning his eternal priesthood, a goal that was ultimately accomplished in his death. In Philippians 2 verse 8, Paul wrote, being found in appearance as a man, Jesus humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Just as Jesus was setting his face toward Jerusalem and his death, he told some Pharisees that he was headed there because that's where he would be perfected. Luke 13:32. The word perfected here could also refer to consecration. In other words, just as Aaron and his sons were consecrated to the high priestly office through sacrifices, Exodus 29, so Jesus was consecrated to the office by the sacrifice of himself. Before discussing the phrase, the author of eternal salvation, recall chapter 2 verse 10 where, speaking of Jesus, Paul said that it was fitting to make the author of salvation perfect through sufferings. Although this is parallel to chapter 5 verses 7 through 9 in its primary thought and should therefore definitely be consulted when studying chapter 5, yet there's a slightly unnoticeable difference in the New King James Version. As mentioned in the remarks at chapter 2 verse 10, the New King James Version would have been better off in this case retaining the King James Version translation of captain, because it refers to the idea of Jesus being the leader of man's salvation, the one who paved the way for us, or like the word forerunner in chapter 6 verse 20. But the original word for author here in chapter 5 verse 9 is a word which, although similar in meaning to the word in chapter 2 verse 10, actually refers to the idea of Jesus being the cause or the source of salvation. You might also even check out or compare Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2, where this idea is brought up by Paul. The salvation of Christ here in verse 9 is described as eternal. Neither the law of Moses nor the Aaronic Levitical priesthood provided for eternal salvation. The sins of the people were merely rolled forward till the perfected Jesus could become the author and the captain of a flawless salvation. In fact, chapter 7 verse 19 reads, the law made nothing perfect. And chapter 7 verse 11 reads, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek? Following that, in chapter 7 verse 28, it says, The law appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath which came after the law appoints the Son who has been perfected forever. Then lastly, chapter 9 verses 12 and 15 read, with his own blood, Jesus entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. When Paul brought up salvation to all who obey him in verse 9, the thought behind verses 7 and 8 comes to mind, meaning that just as Jesus became Savior by obedience, we become saved by obedience. So since obedience was essential for Jesus to become Savior, why would anyone assume he could be saved without obedience and submission? Even faith toward God and Christ for salvation is a command, according to Acts 16:31. That, of course, goes right against Calvinism, because you can't command that which God gives you in the first place. So again, Acts 16:31, faith or belief is commanded in relationship to salvation. All right, last verse in this study, verse 10. Jesus was called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. The word as was unnecessarily, perhaps even detrimentally, supplied here. And the word for called means to dub or bestow a name upon, such as when parents-to-be ask each other, what shall we call our baby? Meaning, by what name should we choose to call him or her? Thus, this verse is simply saying that because Jesus reached his Father's goal for him as high priest, God dubbed him high priest after the likeness of Melchizedek. Actually, as the term dubbed suggests, the word for called carries with it the idea of performing this dubbing publicly, meaning that as he was pleased to call Jesus his son at his baptism, God was pleased to call him our high priest. And how was this accomplished publicly? Through Jesus' resurrection, appearances, and ascension to the heavenly mercy seat. Well, in summary of verses 4 through 10, as Paul began writing about in chapter 2, verse 17, there can be no doubt that, unlike Aaron, Jesus is perfectly qualified to be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, because he learned obedience as a human through the experience of enduring toils, trials, and temptations that were even far greater than those endured by mere men, and without succumbing to the pressure of sin. This is why, number 1, he was appointed high priest directly by God himself. Number 2, his appointment was after that of Melchizedek instead of Aaron, hence everlasting. Number 3, he's the source of eternal salvation to all those who, like him, obey. And number 4, he's the helper of the faithful while we're on this trying planet. All right, I'm going to move on to page 309 of the book to read to you my translation of verses 4 through 10. And no one receives this honor on his own merit, but, just as Aaron was, he's called by God. Likewise, therefore, Christ didn't exalt himself to be high priest, but the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have fathered you." Furthermore, in a different passage he said, "You're a priest throughout the age in the order of Melchizedek." Christ, with mighty outcries and tears in the days of his flesh, offered up supplications and petitions to the one able to save him from death, and was heard due to his fervent piety. And indeed as a son he, through the things he experienced, came to understand submission. And having been perfected, he became to all those obeying him the cause of a once-for-all time salvation, because he has been dubbed under God as high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So there you have it, lesson 12 in my book Hebrews, From Flawed to Flawless, Fulfilled. I appreciate you being with me again, and we will catch you next week for the next installment. Have a great week.